The first sign something was wrong wasn't dramatic. It was an email that wasn't meant for me. I was 31 years old, sitting at my kitchen counter in Arlington, Virginia, drinking reheated coffee and scrolling through my inbox before work. Monday morning routine. Nothing special. I had a meeting at 9, a report due by noon, and a flight booked for later that week to visit my parents for Christmas. That trip mattered more to them than to me. It always did. The email came in at 7:14 a.m., flagged as urgent, from an address I recognized immediately, my mother's accountant. The subject line read, "Updated beneficiary distribution, final draft." For a few seconds, I just stared at it. Then I clicked. The message was clearly part of an ongoing thread. I could tell by the clipped tone, the assumption of shared context. Names were listed, percentages, assets, a summary table. At the top of the document was my father's name. Below it, my younger sister, Natalie. Then my older brother, Marcus. My name wasn't there. I scrolled. Slowly. Once. Twice. Nothing. At the bottom, a sentence caught my eye. Per your instruction, Eleanor will not be included in the revised distribution. Eleanor. Me. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic exactly, but recognition. The kind that comes when something you've sensed for years finally steps into the light. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I didn't even feel shocked. I felt stupid. Stupid for believing the story I'd been fed since childhood. That everything was equal, just complicated. That my parents meant well. That sacrifices were temporary. That patience would be rewarded. I forwarded the email to my personal address, then archived it. No reply, no reaction. I finished my coffee, got dressed, went to work. That's how it started. Not with a fight, not with accusations, but with quiet confirmation that whatever love I thought existed between us had always come with conditions. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I'm the middle child. And until that morning, I believed I was still part of my family. Growing up, I was the reliable one, the one who didn't cause trouble. Marcus was the golden boy, the firstborn, groomed early to take over my father's construction company. Natalie was the baby, sensitive, artistic, always needing support. I was the buffer, the one who made things easier. If there was tension, I smoothed it over. If someone needed help, I showed up. I moved out early, paid my own way through graduate school, never asked for money, never complained when holidays revolved around everyone else's needs. My parents called it independence. I called it survival. After college, I built a career in corporate compliance for a defense contractor outside D.C. Boring work, good pay, clean records. I specialized in audits, risk mitigation, and regulatory oversight. I made sure rules were followed. Funny how that never mattered at home. The trip to visit my parents loomed over the rest of the week. I considered canceling, pretending I was sick, letting things stay buried. But something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't confused. I wasn't guessing. I had proof, and proof changes how silence feels. Christmas Eve dinner was exactly how it always was. My mother fussed over the table. My father talked business with Marcus. Natalie complained about her freelance clients and hinted she might move back home. No one mentioned the email. No one mentioned money. No one mentioned me, beyond surface-level questions. How's work? Still traveling so much? You look tired. I watched them carefully now. The way my mother avoided eye contact when Marcus mentioned expansion plans. The way my father nodded approvingly when Natalie talked about taking time off to find herself. I realized then that the decision hadn't been recent. It had been assumed. After dinner, my father asked Marcus to step into his office to look at something. Natalie followed. My mother started clearing plates. I stood there alone in the dining room, listening to muffled voices through the wall. Laughter. Agreement. I pulled my phone out and opened the forwarded email. There it was. The line that erased me. Later that night, my mother knocked on my guest room door. "Everything okay?" she asked. I looked at her. Really looked. She was smiling, but her eyes were guarded, measuring. "Yes," I said. "Everything's fine." She nodded, relieved. And in that moment, I understood something with painful clarity. They didn't fear confrontation. They feared disruption. As long as I stayed quiet, the system worked. But I wasn't quiet anymore. I just hadn't told them yet. The next morning, I booked a flight home 2 days early. Not out of anger, out of intent. Because once you see how the game is played, you don't flip the table right away. You learn the rules, and then you decide how to end it. I didn't confront anyone before I left. That surprised me at first. Old versions of me would have rehearsed the conversation all night, planned the questions, tried to sound calm while begging for honesty. But that morning, as I packed my bag and zipped it closed, I felt something steadier take hold. Observation. I hugged my mother in the kitchen. She smelled like coffee and cinnamon, the same way she always had. My father clapped me on the shoulder, distracted, already thinking about work. Marcus barely looked up from his phone. Natalie told me to text when I landed. No one asked why I was leaving early. That mattered. On the flight back to D.C., I replayed my life. Not emotionally, but structurally, the way I would analyze a failing process at work. Inputs, outputs, incentives. The pattern was obvious once I stopped romanticizing it. Marcus was rewarded for ambition, even when it failed. My parents absorbed his debts, bailed him out of bad investments, praised his risk-taking as leadership. Natalie was protected from consequence. If she struggled, it was because the world was harsh. If she succeeded, it was because she was gifted. Either way, she was never expected to stand on her own. And me? I was the pressure valve. If something needed doing quietly, I did it. If something went wrong, I absorbed it. If someone was uncomfortable, I adjusted. I had been cast as the solution, not the priority. And solutions, I was realizing, are only valued as long as they remain invisible. Back home, I returned to routine. Work, gym, groceries. On the surface, nothing changed. Internally, everything did. I started pulling documents, not dramatically, methodically. Old emails, family group threads, notes from past conversations that suddenly read differently. I requested copies of public filings related to my father's company, something I had never felt the need to do before. What I found wasn't illegal. It was strategic. The company had been restructured twice in the last decade. Shares redistributed, advisory roles created for Natalie, a future leadership plan that centered Marcus entirely. My parents weren't reacting to circumstances. They were planning a legacy, one that didn't include me. A week later, my mother called. "Your father mentioned you left early," she said casually. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I replied. "Just busy." She paused. "You know," she said, "we've always admired how independent you are." There it was, the compliment that doubled as justification. "I know," I said. "Well," she continued, "your father and I were talking about the future, about making things simpler." Simpler for whom, I wondered. "That makes sense," I said. Another pause. Longer this time. "We assume you'll be fine no matter what," she said. "You always are." I closed my eyes briefly. That sentence explained everything in the email. They weren't punishing me. They were reallocating resources based on perceived need. And in their minds, my competence had disqualified me from consideration. "I'm glad you have that confidence in me," I said evenly. She sounded relieved. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at nothing. At work, I would have called this what it was: misaligned incentives. They had taught me to be capable, then penalized me for it. That night, I called my friend Rachel. We'd known each other since grad school. She worked as an estate attorney in Maryland. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. "I need a hypothetical answered," I said. She laughed softly. "Those are never hypothetical." "If a parent revises beneficiaries without informing one adult child," I continued, "what obligations do they have?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. "Are we talking about a will?" she asked. "Or inter vivos transfer?" "Both," I said. That got her attention. "There are disclosure requirements," she said carefully, "and fiduciary duties, depending on how assets are structured." "Why?" I took a breath. "Because I think my parents made decisions assuming I wouldn't question them." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "And will you?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Then do nothing yet," she replied. "Watch. Gather. Let them move first." That advice felt familiar. It was what I did for a living. Over the next month, the pieces kept revealing themselves. A casual comment from Marcus about transition timing. Natalie mentioning she'd been helping Mom with paperwork. My father asking me, out of nowhere, whether I had plans to move out of state. They weren't hiding it well anymore. They assumed I was still playing my role. I attended meetings, took notes, smiled when appropriate. Inside, I was mapping every pressure point. Thanksgiving came and went without incident. Christmas gifts were smaller than usual for me, larger for Natalie. No one mentioned it. I noticed. The real trigger came in January. A registered letter arrived at my apartment from my parents' lawyer. Subject: Estate Planning Update. Notice of Intent. I read it slowly. The letter stated that my parents intended to finalize revised estate documents within 30 days. It encouraged open communication and noted that distributions had been adjusted to reflect family involvement and future contribution. Still no mention of me by name, just implication. I forwarded the letter to Rachel. Her response came back fast. They're formalizing exclusion. You need representation. I stared at the screen, not because I was afraid, because for the first time, I saw the line clearly. This wasn't about hurt feelings. This was about being quietly removed from a future I had helped build. They weren't pushing me out with force. They were assuming I wouldn't resist. I closed my laptop and sat back. This was the moment where things could still be smoothed over, where I could call, ask questions, accept reassurances, be told not to worry. That path was still open, but I didn't want it, because I finally understood the cost. Peace in my family had always been rented, and the rent was my silence. I wasn't going to pay it anymore. The next step wouldn't be emotional. It would be precise. And once taken, there would be no pretending this was just a misunderstanding, because systems don't accidentally erase people. They do it on purpose. And now, I was ready to respond. I hired a lawyer, the same way I made most serious decisions in my life. Quietly, without announcing it, without asking permission. Rachel referred me to Thomas Klein, a trusts and estates attorney in Alexandria, who specialized in high-conflict family cases. He didn't advertise himself that way, but Rachel said he had a reputation for something rare. He didn't flinch. Our first meeting took place on a rainy Tuesday morning. His office was understated. No family photos, no inspirational quotes, just shelves of binders and a large window overlooking a parking lot. I liked that. I handed him a folder. Inside were printouts of the email, the registered letter, public filings related to my father's company, and a timeline I had drafted myself. He didn't interrupt while he read. When he finally looked up, he didn't ask how I felt. He asked, "Do you want to stop them, or do you want to document them?" I blinked. "What's the difference?" I asked. "Stopping them means confrontation," he said. "It means they know you're watching, and they adjust behavior. Documenting them means letting them proceed while we build a record." I thought about my parents, about how carefully they managed appearances, how allergic they were to conflict that threatened control. "Document," I said. He nodded once. "Then we do nothing yet," he said, "except prepare." Preparation, it turned out, was not passive. Over the next few weeks, Thomas helped me understand the architecture of my parents' plan. Not emotionally, legally. The estate wasn't just a will, it was a network. Trusts, corporate shares, transfer on death accounts, advisory roles that came with compensation but no liability. Each piece, on its own, looked reasonable. Together, they formed a funnel. Resources flowed toward Marcus and Natalie. Authority flowed toward Marcus. Oversight was minimal. Accountability, non-existent. And me? I was absent. Not mentioned, not protected, not acknowledged. Exclusion by omission is still exclusion, Thomas said. And in some cases, it's actionable. The key, he explained, was timing. They were rushing. Rushing often meant mistakes. February arrived with a surprise invitation. My parents were hosting a family meeting. That phrase alone raised my pulse. It had never meant collaboration. It meant announcement. The email came from my mother, sent to all three of us. "Your father and I want to go over some plans for the future. It's important we're all on the same page." All. I showed the email to Thomas. He smiled faintly. "This is good," he said. "Go. Say nothing. Take notes." The meeting took place at my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon. Same dining room, same heavy table, same framed photos of milestones I barely remembered being present for. Marcus arrived late. Natalie sat close to my mother, legs tucked beneath her, notebook in hand like a student ready to please. My father stood at the head of the table. "We've been thinking a lot about legacy," he began. "About what makes sense moving forward." I kept my face neutral. He spoke for 20 minutes. About the company. About stability. About fairness defined through contribution. About how different children needed different things. No one said my name. Finally, Natalie spoke. "So Marcus would take over operations," she said brightly. "And I'd continue helping Mom with finances?" My father nodded. "And Eleanor," my mother added, turning to me, "you've always done well on your own. We assumed you'd prefer flexibility." I looked at her. "Assumed? I wasn't aware assumptions were part of the planning process," I said calmly. The room stilled. Marcus frowned. Natalie looked uncomfortable. My mother's smile tightened. "We just meant," she began, "that you don't need the same kind of support." "I see," I said. That was it. No argument. No pushback. Thomas had warned me. The first person to react emotionally loses leverage. They continued talking, relieved. Interpreting my silence as acceptance, I observed. My father referenced documents he hadn't shared. Natalie mentioned accounts she had access to. Marcus spoke confidently about decisions not yet finalized. They were ahead of schedule, and they were sloppy. After the meeting, my father pulled me aside. "You're quiet," he said. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I replied. "I appreciate being included." He smiled, satisfied. I drove home and typed up a detailed memo while everything was fresh. Names, statements, implications. Thomas reviewed it the next day. "This helps," he said. A lot. 2 weeks later, my parents made their move. I found out through a third party. A former colleague of my father's called me. Awkward and apologetic. "I thought you should know," he said. "Your dad's transferring some shares." Made it sound like it was already settled. "Settled how?" I asked. He hesitated. "Like you weren't involved." I thanked him and hung up. That afternoon, Thomas filed a formal request for disclosure, not a lawsuit. Not yet, just a demand for transparency regarding changes that materially affected my interests as an heir under prior estate documents. The response came faster than expected. Through their lawyer. It was defensive, curt, dismissive. They claimed no obligation to consult me, framed their decisions as private. Accused me, indirectly, of misunderstanding. Thomas leaned back in his chair after reading it. "They didn't expect resistance," he said. "And now they're irritated." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means they'll escalate," he said. "People who are used to compliance always do." He was right. 3 days later, Marcus called. "You blindsided them," he said without greeting. "I asked for information," I replied. "You're making this adversarial," he snapped. "Why can't you just trust them?" "Because trust requires transparency," I said, "and they didn't offer any." He scoffed. "You're acting like a victim," he said. I paused. "No," I replied. "I'm acting like an adult." He hung up. That night, I lay awake thinking about how quickly the narrative shifted. From independent daughter to difficult problem. From silence as virtue to silence as threat. They had always relied on my restraint. Now, it made them nervous. The first crack appeared, not in their finances, but in their story. They began contradicting themselves, over-explaining, justifying choices that didn't require defense unless challenged. That was the thing about control. It only feels stable when no one pushes back. And I wasn't pushing yet. I was letting them reveal how far they were willing to go to keep things exactly as they wanted. The next step wouldn't be subtle. They would force it. And when they did, they would cross a line they couldn't uncross. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I could feel it approaching. Because once silence stops protecting a system, the system turns on the silent one. And I was done protecting it. The confirmation came on a Thursday afternoon, disguised as routine. I was at work, reviewing an internal audit report, when Thomas emailed me with the subject line, "They filed." No punctuation, no explanation, just fact. I closed my office door before opening the attachment. Years in compliance had trained me to recognize when a document wasn't just informational, but consequential. It was a copy of an amended trust filing. My parents had finalized it. No delay, no discussion, no notice to me beyond what the law minimally required. They hadn't removed me entirely. That would have been too obvious, too easy to challenge. Instead, They had done something more calculated. They reduced me to a contingent beneficiary. If Marcus survived them, I received nothing. If Natalie survived them, I received nothing. If both survived them, I effectively ceased to exist in their future. I sat very still as I read. This wasn't emotional decision-making. This wasn't fear or confusion or panic. This was strategy. They insulated themselves, Thomas said when I called him. They think this limits exposure. Does it? I asked. It limits theirs, he said, not yours. That distinction mattered, because up until now, they had framed everything as preference, as discretion, as parents making choices. This document changed that. This was exclusion formalized. What do we do? I asked. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Before I tell you, he said carefully, I need to know something. Are you prepared for this to stop being quiet? I looked out the window of my office at the gray sprawl of the city. Yes, I said. Then we respond, he replied. Not with anger, with precision. The first step was a notice of objection, filed within the statutory window, narrowly tailored, calm in tone. It challenged the amendment on one basis only: lack of informed consent and potential undue influence in the restructuring of interrelated assets. No accusations, no moral language, just questions. Who advised whom? Who benefited disproportionately? Who had access to what information, and when? The notice went out on Monday. By Wednesday, my phone rang. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was short, tight. We need to talk. This is getting out of hand. Out of hand. That phrase always meant one thing in my family. You're disrupting something we were counting on. Marcus called next. Do you have any idea what you've done? He asked, voice low and furious. I asked for transparency, I replied. You hired a lawyer, he snapped. You escalated this. No, I said evenly. They did. When they finalized the amendment, he laughed bitterly. You're really doing this, he said. Over money. I paused. This isn't about money, I said. It's about consent. You were never promised anything, he shot back. That's not true, I said, and you know it. He went quiet. You always do this, he said finally. You act reasonable while making everyone else look bad. I almost smiled. That's not acting, I said. That's documentation. He hung up. The backlash was immediate and coordinated. Extended family reached out. Old family friends. People who had no details but plenty of opinions. Your parents are heartbroken. You're being ungrateful. Why are you tearing the family apart? I didn't respond. Thomas warned me they would try to shift the battlefield. When facts aren't favorable, he said, people try emotion. At work, the pressure came in a subtler form. A board member I barely knew asked me how things were at home. A senior colleague suggested I might want to take some time. I thanked them, declined politely, documented everything. My parents were not just managing their estate. They were managing perception. And perception, I was realizing, was their real asset. 2 weeks later, the second move came. A letter from their attorney. Not hostile, not threatening. An offer. They proposed a settlement. A lump sum payout. Confidentiality. No admission of wrongdoing. In exchange, I would waive all future claims and withdraw my objection. Thomas reviewed it line by line. They're trying to buy silence, he said. How much? I asked. He told me the number. It was generous. Not equal, not fair, but enough to make walking away tempting. They think you'll take it, he added, because it's easier. I sat quietly, considering it, not the money. The message. This offer confirmed what I already knew. They weren't afraid of losing me. They were afraid of scrutiny. I declined. Through Thomas. Without counteroffer. That's when things stopped being polite. My parents froze communication entirely. No calls, no emails, no messages through intermediaries. But behind the scenes, they moved faster. Thomas uncovered accelerated asset transfers, advisory roles converted to ownership stakes, paperwork executed with unusual urgency. They're trying to outrun you, he said. Can they? I asked. He shook his head. They're leaving a trail. And then came the mistake, the one they wouldn't be able to explain away. A transfer was executed incorrectly. A corporate asset moved without proper authorization. A signature missing. A timing discrepancy that contradicted earlier filings. Small. Technical. Devastating. Thomas stared at the document, then looked up at me. "This," he said, "changes everything." I felt my pulse steady, not spike. "What does it mean?" I asked. "It means," he replied, "this isn't just about family anymore. It's about compliance." I exhaled slowly. For the first time since the email months earlier, I felt something close to relief. Because this was my terrain. Rules, records, accountability. They had underestimated many things about me, but most of all, they underestimated how dangerous it is to exclude the person who knows how systems break. The next step would no longer be private. Once compliance gets involved, silence stops being an option. And my family was about to learn that control collapses quickly when it's dragged into daylight. Thomas didn't rush the next step. That, more than anything, told me how serious the mistake was. If it had been minor, he would have moved quickly to capitalize. But instead, he slowed everything down, asked for confirmations twice, and brought in a forensic accountant I had never met. Her name was Linda Perez, early 50s, precise voice, no small talk. She joined our call with one question. "Do you want to win quietly?" she asked. "Or do you want to win completely?" I didn't hesitate. "Completely," I said. Linda walked us through what she had found. The improperly executed transfer wasn't just sloppy. It violated internal governance rules of my father's company, rules that had been put in place years earlier to satisfy lenders and regulators. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had helped draft some of those controls in an informal advisory capacity years ago, back when my father still asked for my input. They had bypassed them. More importantly, they had backdated documents to make it appear as though approvals had occurred earlier than they actually had. "That's not just a family issue," Linda said. "That's a compliance issue, and potentially a disclosure issue," Thomas added, depending on who relied on those records. I leaned back in my chair. "So what happens now?" I asked. "We give them one opportunity to correct it," Thomas said. "Formally, in writing. And if they don't, then it's no longer your problem," he replied. "It becomes everyone else's." The notice went out that Friday, carefully worded, neutral, specific. It identified the discrepancy, cited the relevant governance provisions, and requested clarification and remediation within 10 business days. No accusations, no threats, just facts. The response came in 3, from my father himself, not his lawyer. The email was longer than anything he had ever sent me. He wrote about stress, about timing, about how family matters shouldn't be treated like hostile audits. He accused me, indirectly, of betrayal, of airing private matters, of turning my back on everything he had built. He ended with a sentence that stayed with me. "You know better than anyone how much this company means to me." I forwarded the email to Thomas. He responded with one line. "He's arguing emotion against process. That means he knows he's exposed." My mother didn't write. Natalie didn't write. Marcus did. Not to argue, to negotiate. He called late Sunday night. "What do you want?" he asked, skipping any attempt at warmth. "I want compliance," I said. He scoffed. "You're enjoying this," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm documenting it." He was quiet for a moment. "Look," he said. "Things moved fast, maybe too fast. We can fix it." "Then fix it," I said. "It's not that simple," he snapped. "That's not my problem," I replied. The 10-day window closed without remediation. Instead, my parents' attorney sent a letter disputing Linda's findings. It was vague, defensive, full of qualifiers. Thomas smiled when he read it. "They doubled down," he said. "That's the worst thing they could have done." The next move wasn't mine. It was automatic. Thomas filed a formal disclosure with the relevant oversight body, attaching documentation and requesting review. My name wasn't highlighted. My parents' names weren't emphasized. It was framed as an internal governance concern raised by an interested party, anonymous in effect, if not in reality. Once filed, it couldn't be withdrawn. 3 days later, my father's company received notice of inquiry. That was when the tone changed. My phone lit up. Calls, messages, voicemails. My mother cried. My father raged. Marcus begged. Natalie accused me of destroying the family. I didn't respond to any of them, because for the first time, the situation wasn't personal. It was procedural. And procedures don't care about intent. They care about records. Linda worked quickly, methodically. She uncovered additional irregularities. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal on its own, but patterns, shortcuts, assumptions that no one would ever look too closely. They hadn't expected scrutiny from inside. At work, I felt steadier than I had in months. I was operating in familiar territory, reviewing documents, asking neutral questions, letting other people draw conclusions. Susan noticed. "You seem lighter," she said during a check-in. "I am," I replied honestly. The oversight inquiry expanded. My father's lenders requested clarification. A partner delayed a deal pending review. Insurance carriers asked questions. Control started slipping. And that's when my parents made their biggest mistake yet. They tried to blame me publicly, through intermediaries, through selective disclosure, through quiet conversations with people they thought would side with them. The story they spread was simple. Eleanor is unstable. She's angry. She's overreacting. They framed the issue as a family dispute, not a governance failure. Unfortunately for them, the record didn't agree. Facts have a way of outlasting narratives. A week later, Thomas received a call from my parents' attorney. The tone was different now. Measured. Careful. They wanted to revisit settlement. On what terms? I asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. "They're offering equalization," he said finally. Equalization. Equal shares. Not a payout. Not hush money. Structural correction. It was what I should have had from the beginning. "They're also requesting withdrawal of the disclosure," he added. I laughed once. "That's not possible," I said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." The offer came through formally the next day. Revised estate documents. Shared governance. Full transparency. In exchange, they asked for cooperation going forward. No apology. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just a reset. I read the offer slowly. Then I asked Thomas a question that surprised even me. "If I accept this," I said, "what happens the next time I don't comply?" He didn't hesitate. "They'll do it again," he said, "just more carefully." I closed the folder. "Then I'm not interested," I said. Silence hung between us. "You understand," he said slowly, "that this will escalate further." "Yes," I replied. "That's the point." For years, I had been the person who absorbed impact so others wouldn't have to. The buffer. The release valve. Now, I was removing myself from that function entirely. And without it, the system was already destabilizing. They could fix documents. They could offer money. What they couldn't do was put me back in the role they needed me to play. And without that role, everything they had built on top of it was starting to crack. The next chapter wouldn't be about offers. It would be about consequences. Because once process replaces permission, control has nowhere left to hide. The inquiry didn't announce itself with drama. It arrived as a calendar invite. My father forwarded it to Marcus by mistake, who then forwarded it to Natalie, who then forwarded it to me with a single line. "Did you see this?" I didn't respond. The invite was from a regional compliance officer requesting a preliminary review meeting. Neutral language, broad scope. Enough authority to slow everything down without accusing anyone of anything. That was how pressure really worked. Not with explosions. With pauses. The company postponed a planned expansion. A lender delayed a credit renewal. A supplier asked for clarification on governance structure before signing a long-term agreement. Small hesitations. But hesitations add up. My parents stopped calling entirely. Marcus tried once more, then went silent. Natalie posted vague quotes on social media about loyalty and betrayal. I muted her without comment. I focused on my own life. Work intensified. Susan looped me into higher-level planning earlier than expected. I found myself in rooms where decisions were made instead of explained afterward. No one mentioned my family situation. No one needed to. Competence speaks quietly. One afternoon, Thomas called with an update. "They're pushing back hard," he said, "but not where it matters." "Where does it matter?" I asked. "Third parties," he replied. "They're nervous." That was the real shift. My parents had always operated inside a closed loop. Family handled family. Disputes stayed private. Appearances were managed internally. Once outside parties became involved, that loop broke. They could argue with me. They couldn't argue with institutions. The first casualty was timing. The trust amendments that had been rushed through were now under review. Implementation stalled. Distributions paused. Control mechanisms frozen, pending clarification. The thing my parents had wanted most, certainty, was gone. I received an email from my mother's personal account late one night. Not accusatory, not pleading. Confused. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she wrote. "We raised you better than this." I read it twice, then deleted it, because that sentence wasn't about understanding. It was about obedience. A few days later, Linda sent over an updated report. She had identified discrepancies not just in the recent transfer, but in historical reporting tied to advisory compensation. Again, nothing overtly criminal, but enough to raise questions about disclosure and valuation. "They assumed no one would ever connect the dots," she said during our call. "Why would they?" I asked. "Because you were the only one capable of doing it," she replied. "And you were inside the system, not outside." That hit harder than I expected. I had protected them without realizing it, not by lying, by not looking. Once I stepped out of the role, the blind spots became visible to everyone else. Marcus broke the silence a week later. He showed up at my apartment unannounced. I didn't invite him in. We stood in the hallway, the space between us narrow and charged. "This has gone too far," he said. "Has it?" I asked. "Dad's health isn't great," he snapped. "Mom's barely sleeping. The company's under review. Deals are stalling. You're tearing everything apart." I studied him. "You mean the system you benefited from," I said calmly. "The one built on assumptions and silence." He looked away. "You always think you're right," he muttered. "No," I said. "I think I'm responsible. There's a difference." He laughed bitterly. "You think this ends well?" he asked. "I think it ends honestly," I replied. He stepped closer. "What do you want from us?" he asked. "An apology? Money? Control?" I shook my head. "I want distance," I said. "And documentation." "That's not a relationship," he said. "No," I agreed. "It's an exit." He stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language. "You're choosing this," he said. "Yes," I replied. For the first time, he left without another word. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The inquiry expanded, not dramatically, methodically. Requests for records, clarifications, timelines. My father's attorney tried to limit scope. The compliance officer declined. At work, I was offered a formal promotion, director level, more responsibility, more visibility. Susan was direct. "You've demonstrated exceptional judgment under pressure," she said. "We value that." I accepted. Not as a statement, as a step forward. 2 days later, Thomas called, with a tone I hadn't heard before. "They want to meet," he said. "All of them?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "In person, with counsel." I closed my eyes briefly. This was the moment they had avoided. Not confrontation. Negotiation. On equal footing. "When?" I asked. "Next week," he said. "And Eleanor? This isn't about fixing documents anymore." "What is it about?" I asked. "Containment," he replied. "They want to stop the spread." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Then we don't," I said. Silence hung on the line. "You're sure?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "I'm done managing their outcomes." After we hung up, I stood by my window, watching the city settle into evening. For years, I had believed that holding things together was love, that keeping peace was maturity, that asking for less meant being more evolved. I saw it differently now. Peace that depends on one person shrinking isn't peace. It's maintenance. And I was no longer willing to maintain a system that only functioned when I stayed invisible. The meeting would happen. The offers would come. The pressure would increase. But something fundamental had already shifted. They were reacting. And I was no longer afraid of what that reaction might cost them, because the cost of staying silent had already been paid. By me. For years. And I wasn't paying it again. The conference room my parents' attorney chose was intentionally neutral. Downtown. Glass walls. Neutral art. Bottled water lined up like an offering. Everything about the space said professionalism, restraint, reason. It was a performance. Thomas arrived 10 minutes early, with a single legal pad and no briefcase. Linda joined us remotely, her camera already on, her expression unreadable. My parents arrived together. That alone was new. My father looked older than I remembered. Not frail, just thinner, tighter around the mouth. My mother clutched her purse with both hands, knuckles pale. Marcus followed them in, jaw set, eyes scanning the room like he expected an ambush. Natalie wasn't there. That omission felt deliberate. We took seats across the table from one another. No greetings, their attorney began. We appreciate everyone making time, he said. The goal today is resolution. Thomas nodded. Clarity, he corrected. A flicker of irritation crossed the attorney's face before smoothing out. My father cleared his throat. This has gone far beyond what we intended, he said, looking at me directly for the first time in weeks. We're here to fix it. I met his gaze calmly. Intent doesn't reverse impact, I said. My mother inhaled sharply, as if wounded. We never meant to exclude you, she said quickly. We just assumed. That's the problem, I interrupted gently. You assumed. The attorney raised a hand. Let's stay constructive. Thomas leaned forward. Constructive requires acknowledgement, he said. So let's start with the facts. He slid a document across the table, a timeline. Every transfer, every amendment, every advisory role converted into equity. Every discrepancy Linda had flagged, now organized cleanly. My parents' attorney skimmed it, then went very still. This isn't necessary, my father said tightly. We're prepared to be generous. Thomas didn't look at him. Generosity is discretionary, he said. Compliance is not. The room shifted. This wasn't a family conversation anymore. This was a reckoning. My mother leaned toward me. Eleanor, she said softly, why are you doing this? I considered her question. Because I was removed from decisions that affected my future, I replied. Quietly, strategically, without my consent. We thought you'd be fine, she whispered. I nodded. And because of that, I said, you decided I didn't need a voice. Marcus slammed his hand lightly on the table. This is insane, he said. You're risking everything for paperwork. I turned to him. No, I said. I'm correcting it. Their attorney cleared his throat. We're prepared to offer a revised structure, he said. Equal distribution, shared oversight, immediate withdrawal of objections. Thomas raised an eyebrow. And the compliance inquiry? He asked. The attorney hesitated. We'd ask for cooperation, he said carefully. Define cooperation, Thomas said. Assistance in clarifying misunderstandings, he replied. Linda's voice cut in through the speaker. There are no misunderstandings, she said calmly. Only records. The silence that followed was heavy. My father rubbed his temples. What do you want? He asked again. Voice tired now, not angry. I took a breath. I want what I should have had from the beginning, I said. Transparency, consent, and distance. My mother's eyes widened. Distance? She echoed. Yes, I said. I don't want a role in the business. I don't want advisory titles. I don't want to be leveraged as proof of unity. Marcus scoffed. Then why are you here? I looked at him. Because I won't be erased quietly, I said. And I won't be bought back into silence. Thomas slid another document for a proposal. Not a settlement. A separation. My parents would unwind my involvement entirely. A clean exit. Fair valuation based on historical contributions. No future obligations. No expectations. No confidentiality clauses restricting my right to speak truthfully if asked by authorities. In return, I would cease pursuing additional remedies, not withdraw existing disclosures, just stop expanding them. The attorney read it once. Then again, this is unconventional, he said. It's final, Thomas replied. My mother's voice trembled. So you're leaving, she said. I left months ago, I replied. This just makes it official. My father stared at the document. This damages the company, he said. No, I replied. It corrects it. Marcus stood abruptly. You're choosing strangers over family, he said. I stayed seated. I'm choosing myself, I said. You were never in danger of losing anything. That landed. The attorney asked for a recess. We waited. I watched my parents whisper to each other in the corner. Saw my father's shoulder slump, my mother's hands shake. Marcus pacing like a caged animal. For years I would have rushed in, smoothed things over, offered reassurance. I didn't move. After 20 minutes, they returned. My father spoke. We'll agree, he said quietly, to the separation. My mother looked at him, shocked. We can't, she started. He raised a hand. We can, he said. And we will. His eyes met mine. This ends here, he said. Yes, I replied. It does. The paperwork would take weeks. valuations, approvals, signatures. But the outcome was decided. As we stood to leave, my mother reached for my arm. "Eleanor," she said, tears in her eyes. "I don't understand when you became like this." I looked at her. "I didn't become anything," I said. "I stopped disappearing." I walked out without looking back. In the elevator, Thomas exhaled slowly. "That," he said, "was decisive." "Yes," I replied, but I knew better. Decisions on paper are one thing. What came next would test whether they could live with the consequences of losing control. Because separation doesn't just end entanglement. It exposes what remains once leverage is gone. And I had a feeling they weren't prepared for what that would look like. The days after the meeting felt unreal. Not quiet. Not peaceful. Suspended. Paperwork moved forward exactly as Thomas predicted. Valuations were ordered. Independent firms brought in. Timelines drafted and revised. Everything proceeded with professional courtesy and unmistakable finality. No one called me directly. That alone told me how much had changed. My parents had always relied on proximity, on emotional access, on being able to pull me into conversations where tone mattered more than content. Now, there was only process, and process doesn't flinch. Linda uncovered more as the separation review expanded. Not because she was digging aggressively, but because once you open the door, things tend to wander into view. A deferred compensation agreement Marcus had benefited from. Advisory fees Natalie received without corresponding deliverables. A valuation method that consistently favored internal transfers over external benchmarks. None of it screamed corruption. All of it whispered entitlement. "This happens when no one expects resistance," Linda said during one of our calls. "They start believing structure is optional." That was the moment I realized something important. They hadn't excluded me because I was difficult. They had excluded me because I was inconvenient. I knew how systems worked. I asked questions. I didn't accept explanations that relied on trust alone. Silence had never been my natural state. It had been enforced. The compliance inquiry progressed in parallel. Slowly. Methodically. Exactly as those things always do. My father's attorney attempted to narrow scope again. The oversight body declined again. More documents were requested. More timelines scrutinized. The company's board called an emergency session. Marcus didn't attend. That fact made its way back to me through a mutual contact. "He's furious," the contact said. "Feels betrayed." I didn't ask by whom. At work, my promotion was announced publicly. The email went out company-wide, congratulatory and impersonal. Susan stopped by my office afterward. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and meant it. "Good," she replied. "Because you're about to be very visible." Visibility had once terrified me. Now it felt like insulation. A week later, the first draft of the separation agreement arrived. Thomas reviewed it line by line, made notes, sent it back with revisions that tightened language and removed ambiguity. I didn't argue a single change. This wasn't about squeezing every possible advantage. It was about clarity. My parents signed the revised draft within 48 hours. That speed told me everything. They wanted this done. They wanted me gone. The final numbers were lower than what equal participation would have yielded. Higher than the settlement offer they had tried to use as a muzzle. Fair. Clean. Unarguable. Thomas looked at me across his desk after confirming signatures. "This is a full exit," he said. "Once funds are transferred, there's no coming back." "I know," I replied. "Any regrets?" he asked. I considered it. "No," I said. "Just relief." The transfer happened on a Thursday afternoon. No fanfare, no message, just a confirmation email from my bank. I stared at the number for a long time. Not because of the money, because of what it represented. The last lever they had over me. Gone. That night, I took a long walk through my neighborhood. Winter air sharp in my lungs. Streetlights humming. Ordinary life unfolding around me without any awareness of what had just ended. For the first time since that email months ago, I felt complete, not healed, complete. The compliance inquiry didn't stop, nor should it have. My separation agreement didn't include withdrawal of disclosures, and Thomas had been clear from the beginning that it couldn't. Actions had consequences beyond family arrangements. My parents tried to spin it. Friends heard versions of the story that cast me as overly rigid, emotionally distant, unwilling to compromise. I didn't correct them. Because the people who mattered weren't listening to gossip. They were reading records. A preliminary report was issued. No findings yet, just observations, questions, recommendations for further review. But even that was enough. A potential investor walked away. A lender requested revised covenants. A planned acquisition stalled indefinitely. Control was no longer centralized. And once that happens, narratives stop working. Natalie reached out then, not to apologize, to ask. She sent a message late one night. Do you think this will blow over? I stared at it for a long time, then replied, no. She didn't answer. Marcus didn't either. I didn't expect him to. He had built his identity on inheritance masquerading as achievement. This scrutiny threatened that illusion. It wasn't my job to preserve it. The oversight body scheduled a follow-up review. My father's attorney requested an extension. Denied. Momentum is unforgiving once it starts. One evening, my mother emailed me again. Short. We never thought it would come to this. I read it once, then archived it, because that sentence too was about them, not about me. They hadn't thought about consequences, about fairness, about consent. They had thought about continuity, and continuity had depended on my silence. I was done providing it. The last piece fell into place quietly. Thomas called to let me know the separation agreement had been recorded. It's official, he said. You're no longer tied to any of it. I thanked him. After we hung up, I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, city glowing beyond the windows. There was no victory rush, no satisfaction in watching things unravel. Just a calm certainty. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had stepped out of a structure that required me to disappear. What collapsed afterward wasn't my responsibility. It was the weight of truth finally being applied to something that had never been built to hold it. The next chapter wouldn't be about fallout. It would be about what happens when you're no longer defined by what you resisted, but by what you chose instead. The strangest part was how normal everything looked once I stepped away. No headlines. No dramatic phone calls. No moment where the world seemed to pause and acknowledge what had happened. Arlington still woke up at the same hour. My coffee still tasted slightly burnt if I reheated it too long. Traffic still bottlenecked at the same intersections. Externally, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. For the first few weeks after the separation was finalized, I kept expecting something to pull me back in. A question, a request. A crisis that would require my input because it always had before. It never came. That absence told me more than any confrontation ever could. At work, I settled into my new role fully. Director-level decisions came with consequences that were visible, measurable. When I approved something, I owned it. When I declined something, the reasons were documented. No one accused me of being difficult for asking questions. No one told me I was overthinking. Process was respected here. I realized how much energy I had wasted trying to earn that same respect at home. Susan invited me to lunch one afternoon, something she rarely did outside of official meetings. I'm going to ask you something, she said carefully, and you don't have to answer. I nodded. How did you stay so steady this year? She asked. Most people crumble under half that pressure. I thought about it for a moment. Because I stopped negotiating my reality, I said. She smiled faintly. That tracks. Outside of work, my social circle shifted in subtle ways. Some people faded out, uncomfortable with the version of me that no longer apologized reflexively. Others stepped closer, relieved by the clarity. Rachel checked in often, not to discuss the case, but to talk about books, travel, small things. You sound lighter, she said once. I am, I replied. The oversight review continued, but it no longer felt like something I was involved in. My role had ended when the record was established. Everything after that belonged to the institutions now. That was one evening. I received a voicemail from an unfamiliar number. It was my father. I hadn't heard his voice since the meeting. Eleanor, he said, measured and formal. I'm calling to let you know we're restructuring the company. I thought you should hear it directly. I waited for more. It didn't come. No apology, no reflection. No acknowledgement of how we got here, just information. I didn't call back. Because this, too, was familiar. He wasn't reaching out to reconnect. He was maintaining the appearance of reasonableness. The call confirmed something I had suspected. Distance hadn't changed them. It had simply removed their leverage. A few weeks later, I learned through a mutual acquaintance that Marcus had stepped down from day-to-day operations. Officially, it was framed as strategic repositioning. Unofficially, it was fallout. Natalie had moved back home. That detail surprised me less than I expected. Old systems tend to recreate themselves when stressed. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt finished. I started making decisions I had postponed for years. I renegotiated my lease, took a short trip alone, opened an investment account with a planner who didn't know my family name and didn't care. Each choice felt small. Together, they felt like ownership. One Sunday afternoon, while organizing paperwork, I found an old notebook from my early 20s. Inside were lists I had written back then, goals, boundaries I wanted to have someday, things I promised myself I'd never tolerate. I had broken most of those promises, quietly, over the years. Not because I was weak, because I was trained to confuse endurance with love. Reading those pages now didn't make me sad. It made me proud. I had come back to myself, just later than planned. The last ripple reached me through Natalie. She emailed me once, brief and oddly formal. "I don't know how to talk to you anymore," she wrote. I stared at the message for a long time, then typed back, "You don't have to." I didn't block her. I didn't invite more conversation. I let the boundary stand, without explanation. Because boundaries don't need defending to be real. That night, I sat on my balcony and watched the lights come on across the city. Thousands of windows, thousands of lives intersecting and diverging without ceremony. I thought about how much of my identity had been shaped in opposition. The responsible one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't need much. Walking away had removed that reference point. What remained was quieter and stronger. The thing people don't tell you about choosing yourself is that it doesn't feel triumphant. It feels grounded, unremarkable, in the best way. The next chapter of my life wasn't going to be built around reacting to them. It was going to be built around intention. And intention doesn't rush. It waits until you're ready to listen. The final chapter wouldn't be about what they lost. It would be about what I refused to give up again, and why that decision would outlast every version of the story they told themselves afterward. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between two internal memos. Subject line: opportunity to collaborate. The sender was unfamiliar, but the domain wasn't. It belonged to a private advisory firm that had recently absorbed a portion of my family's former business. Not officially, not publicly, but through quiet asset transfers and strategic consulting contracts that left fingerprints only if you knew where to look. I knew. The message was polite, complimentary, carefully vague. They had followed my work. They admired my measured leadership during a period of transition. They believed there might be mutual benefit in a conversation. I forwarded it to Susan without comment. She replied almost immediately, "Be careful. That's a feeling." She was right. I declined the meeting. Not rudely, not dramatically, just a clean refusal. "Thank you for reaching out. I'm not interested in external collaborations at this time." No explanation. 2 hours later, my phone rang. Marcus. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message. "They're trying to clean this up," he said, voice tight. "You don't have to make it harder than it already is." I didn't respond, because that sentence told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about containment. The system was adjusting, and they were hoping I would help stabilize it, quietly. Again. At work, the year-end review cycle began. Performance metrics, forecasts, planning sessions that stretched long into the evenings. I thrived in it, because here, contribution led to authority, not obligation. Susan called me into her office near the end of the week. "We're building something new," she said, "and I want you leading it." She laid out the plan. A strategic unit focused on oversight and risk assessment, a bridge between operations and governance. It was exactly the space I belonged in. "I want your answer by Friday," she said. I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said. That afternoon, Thomas called with an update I hadn't expected. "They're proposing mediation," he said. "Not legally necessary, just relational." I almost laughed. "No," I said. "We're past that." "They're worried about exposure," he added. "They should be," I replied. "That's not my problem." That night, I ran into Rachel at a neighborhood restaurant. She studied my face for a moment before speaking. "You look different again," she said. How so? I asked. Less cautious, she replied. Like you're not bracing anymore? She was right. For the first time in years, I wasn't anticipating fallout. I was planning forward. A few days later, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a leather-bound photo album. Family events, holidays, old vacations. On the last page was a handwritten note from my mother. We never meant to hurt you. We just didn't know how to let go. I closed the album. That sentence wasn't accountability. It was nostalgia, weaponized as regret. I didn't respond because the past no longer had leverage. The advisory firm reached out again the following week, this time with a specific offer. Consulting role, generous compensation, flexible terms. Susan saw it too. This is influence disguised as opportunity, she said. I know, I replied. I declined. Again. That was when the pressure stopped. Not because they found peace, because they realized I couldn't be moved. The final confirmation came quietly. An internal industry bulletin announced leadership changes within my parents' former company. New oversight, reduced scope, rebranding. The system survived, but it was no longer theirs, and it no longer needed me. That night, I stood in my kitchen, wine glass untouched, and thought about the woman I had been a year ago, the one who believed that staying calm would protect her. That silence was safety. That love meant endurance. I didn't feel angry toward her. I felt grateful. She had done the best she could with the information she had. Now, I had more. The next chapter would close this chapter, not with confrontation, but with clarity. And clarity, once claimed, doesn't ask permission to stay. It simply does. The world didn't collapse when I stopped responding. It didn't even wobble. That realization settled slowly, not as relief, but as truth. All the urgency I had been trained to feel, all the implied consequences of disappointing them, had been constructs. Useful once, obsolete now. The new unit Susan put me in charge of launched quietly. No announcement, no ceremony. Just a calendar invite and a shared folder filled with documents that mattered. I built the framework the way I always had when something needed to last. Methodical, transparent, resilient to ego. People noticed, not because I demanded recognition, but because results don't stay invisible for long. I began receiving invitations to speak internally, then externally. Panels, closed-door roundtables. Conversations where my perspective wasn't tolerated, but sought. It felt strange at first, then normal. That normalization was the real shift. I learned through Thomas that the compliance inquiry had entered its final phase. No dramatic penalties, but firm recommendations, structural changes, oversight mechanisms that would remain long after the headlines faded. Their operating freedom is gone, he said, permanently. I thanked him. And meant it, not for what it did to them, for what it closed for me. Marcus tried once more. He sent a text this time. Short. Careful. I think we should talk. Just us. I stared at it for a long time, then typed back. I don't think so. No explanation. No invitation. Just truth. I blocked the number afterward, not out of anger, but finality. Some doors don't need to be slammed. They just need to stay closed. My mother didn't reach out again. I suspected she had finally understood that emotional appeals no longer worked. Or maybe she hadn't. Either way, the silence held. Thanksgiving came and went. For the first time in my life, I spent it exactly how I wanted. No travel, no performance. Just a quiet dinner with Rachel and 2 colleagues who had become friends. We talked about books, work, plans for the next year. No one asked me to justify myself. No one filled the air with tension disguised as tradition. I slept deeply that night. In early December, Susan stopped by my office with a file tucked under her arm. "You're being recommended," she said. "For what?" I asked. She smiled. "A seat you're not supposed to get yet." I laughed softly. "Apparently, timing isn't a rule," she added. I thought about how often my family had used timing as a weapon. Not yet. Not appropriate. Not the moment. They had delayed me into submission. This time, timing worked differently. I accepted the recommendation, not because it felt like victory, because it felt aligned. A few days later, I ran into an old family acquaintance at a fundraiser. She hesitated before approaching me. "I've heard you're doing very well," she said. "I am," I replied. She nodded, then added, "Your parents talk about you sometimes. They say they don't recognize you anymore." I smiled politely. "That's understandable," I said. "They never really did." She looked startled. I excused myself. Walking back to my car that night, I felt something I hadn't expected. Gratitude. Not for what happened, but for what it forced me to confront. I had spent years trying to be legible to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. Choosing myself didn't make me cold. It made me clear. The story they told about me would continue. It always would. People who lose control rarely accept responsibility. But their version no longer competed with mine, because I was no longer standing in the same room. The final chapter wasn't about revenge. It was about release, and the quiet strength that comes when you stop explaining your worth to people who never intended to hear it. That strength doesn't announce itself. It just builds, and it lasts. The last message I ever received from my father came in early spring. No subject line, no greeting. Just one sentence. "You've made your point." I read it once, then deleted it. Because that sentence, like so many before it, was still about control. About framing the entire rupture as a lesson I had delivered, rather than a boundary I had set. I didn't need him to understand. I needed him to stop having access, and he had. Life settled into something quieter after that. Not smaller. Quieter. The new board role came with responsibilities that stretched me in ways my family never had. There was no emotional leverage here, no unspoken hierarchy, just expectations, performance, and trust built over time. It was the healthiest structure I had ever been part of. Sometimes, in the evenings, I would think about the old house, the dinners where silence carried more meaning than conversation, the way I learned to read the room before speaking, to anticipate discomfort before it surfaced. Those habits didn't disappear overnight, but they loosened. I stopped apologizing automatically, stopped filling pauses, stopped assuming responsibility for other people's emotions. That, more than anything, felt like freedom. Rachel asked me once if I missed them. I considered it carefully. "I miss who I thought they were," I said, "not who they chose to be." She nodded. She understood. The industry moved on, as it always does. New stories replaced old ones. The company that once felt like a family legacy became just another entity, adjusting to regulation and oversight. I became known for something else entirely. Consistency. When I said no, it meant no. When I committed, I followed through. When I walked away, it was without drama. People trusted that. The irony wasn't lost on me. The traits my family dismissed as rigidity were the ones that built my reputation. One evening, after a long day, I stood by my window and watched the city lights flicker on. The same view I had looked at during the worst moments of the unraveling. It looked different now. Not because the city had changed, because I had. I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who believed love required sacrifice without limits, who mistook endurance for loyalty. I wished I could tell her one thing. You don't owe your silence to anyone. Choosing yourself doesn't mean you failed at family. It means you succeeded at being whole. I don't tell this story to prove anything, not to justify my decisions, not to convince anyone I was right. I tell it because there are people living inside systems that only work if they stay small. People who think patience will eventually earn them respect. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop negotiating your place at the table and build one somewhere else. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt erased or controlled in the name of love, you're not alone. You're not difficult. You're not ungrateful. You're aware. And awareness, once claimed, doesn't go back to sleep. If you found value in this story, take a moment to like it, share your thoughts in the comments, or subscribe for more stories about boundaries, accountability, and what happens when the tables finally turn. Some endings aren't loud, they're permanent, and they're yours to choose.